right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Cosmic Conversations. My name is Mary Holt, and normally you see me on Tuesday mornings talking to the younger viewers in your home. But today I'm here to talk to our Assistant Director, Bing Quock, who is going to tell us all about some Morrison Planetarium history. How are you doing, Bing?
Fine, Mary. Thank you. You know, we are approaching the 68th anniversary of Morrison Planetarium. It's not as a big deal as the decadal anniversaries, but a lot of people still ask about the planetarium and its history, and they remember the old facility, the star projector, and we thought that this would be a good opportunity to address some of those questions.
Wonderful. Yeah, and I definitely, when I'm in the planetarium, I still get questions about our old projector and everything. So I know people are interested in that pretty much all the time.
Yeah.
So I think we have slides for you. Yep, there we go.
Speaking of the old projector, there it is on the cover of the 1978 San Francisco telephone book. Remember those?
I do.
That was a really neat thing to have happen for us. Now, this is a rather different kind of planetarium projector than people might be accustomed to seeing, because most people are familiar with the German-style projectors. Planetariums were invented way back in the 1920s, and this was the very first one, the Zeiss Model 1. And this was really an advancement on the idea of how to simulate the nighttime sky, because you have star maps, you have globes. In the 1600s, someone came up with the idea of building a globe that had the paintings of the constellations inside. That idea was elaborated on in the 1900s when someone built a globe and drilled holes through it that light could shine through from outside. So instead of looking at pictures or artwork of constellations, you were looking at star-like points of light, and it looked really realistic. In fact, this particular device, the Atwood Sphere, is now part of the collection at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. And they've got it, it's operating. It really looks very, very cool. But look how small it is. You can only get a few people in there.
How common were these early ones, the Atwood Sphere or the globe? Were they
not very common, because they were rather complicated mechanisms. Now, you could also rotate the globe to simulate the passage of time, but they were small. You could only get a few people in there at a time. So what the Germans came up with was the idea that, well, maybe if you hold the sphere stationary, you don't need a whole sphere, you only need half of it, so you need a dome. But then you could rotate, you could project the stars with a projector, and that was the planetarium projector. And that way you could make a dome as big as you want and accommodate hundreds of people instead of just a few at a time. So that was the idea behind the optical projection planetarium, or the optomechanical projector, as we call it nowadays. And this is sort of like the one that was installed in Chicago in 1930, and that was the first planetarium in the US in 1930. And as early as 1932, there was some interest in building a planetarium in San Francisco, but the idea stalled until after World War II. And there were 6 big planetariums in the US until Morrison Planetarium came along. And these were in Chicago, Philadelphia, as you can see, LA, New York, Pittsburgh, Chapel Hill, and they all had the German Zeiss projector. That really was the standard, and they were the only manufacturers in the world. When Morrison Planetarium decided to build its, or when the Academy of Sciences decided to build a planetarium, they said, we have the experience to build our own, because during World War II, we developed a lot of that information and knowledge. But I do have to mention the planetarium down at the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum in San Jose, because they built their own planetarium and their own projector in 1936. So they were an early one, but they weren't considered a major planetarium, quote unquote. The word major is usually reserved for a dome that's at least 50 feet across, because in a dome that size, the illusion of depth is much more convincing. When you look at something that's only 10 or 20 feet away, the way your eyes focus tells you instinctively that you're not really looking at something very far away. So in a bigger dome, the illusion of the real night sky is much more convincing. But how
many people were they able to fit in their dome there in San Jose?
It was a small dome because it's only 40 feet across. And so that was maybe 50 people, something like that. And here's their projector. Look at this. It's very unusual looking. It looks almost like a robot in an old science fiction movie. And that's the director of the planetarium operating it. It's a really strange looking thing. It no longer exists. It didn't survive. It was limited to one latitude, one location on Earth, and 40-foot dome with a stucco coating on the dome. The acoustics were very, very echoey. But it was a nice try. But we have to admit they did come before we did, but they weren't considered a major planetarium. So I did want to give them that recognition. But just after World War II, it was thought that the Academy could build their own because of a good deal of experience that they had developed during the war. You can see three of the key figures in that project here. Dr. Miller was the director of the Academy. Doc Hanna down at the lower right was the head of the project, and Jimmy Getton up at in the middle there is credited as the designer of the projector. But Doc was a very interesting character. He was a geologist, and he was a real Renaissance man of science. He came from a generation of scientists who built their own equipment. He built microscopes. He built different devices. He helped the oil companies figure out where to drill for oil, and he took part in the Iditarod. He was just an amazing character. And during World War II, he headed up a project under contract with the military to refurbish and repair optical equipment. And he recruited a lot of volunteers here at the Academy. And here's a shot of a bunch of those volunteers at a workshop, which was a converted exhibit hall here at the museum. So they took one of the halls of North American animals and turned it into an optical workshop where all of these people worked on these devices. And during that time, then they built up a lot of experience and knowledge about optics and grinding lenses and mirrors and all that sort of thing. And then when talk came around building a planetarium, they said, you know what, we can do that. We know how to do all this stuff. And so they decided to give it a shot. And here's an early drawing, an early concept of what that projector could look like, because at the time, just after World War II, a projector was not available from the Germans because the factory was damaged and they were just completely broken up. So we couldn't get a projector from the Zeiss company. So we had to become our own manufacturer. And so here's an early concept of what that projector might look like. Really unusual looking, very different from the German projector. And here are some shots of the work being done during that 4-year period between 1948 and 1952, when a lot of the work was done right at the Academy in Golden Gate Park. A lot of the machining, a lot of the fine tuning. The heavy metal castings were done at the Bethlehem shipyards at Hunters Point. That's where the big casing of the projector were done. And that's made of basically cast iron, so it's really heavy. And it was lugged into position in the planetarium. The building was built in 1951, and the projector was brought in, and you can see a lot of difficult, complicated work. And at that time, the staff astronomer Leon Salanave was recruited to figure out which stars to use, how many stars to project. At the time, the German projectors projected about 9,000 stars, which is actually a little too many. It's more than you can see with the unaided eye. You can see about 5,000 or 6,000. And what Leon decided was that, well, let's go with about 4,000, which is a little bit less than you can see with the unaided, but it was sufficiently natural looking and realistic for most people. So he went to.
How did he narrow down those 4,000? What was the criteria he used?
Yeah, it was done by brightness mainly. Of course, you want the brightest stars, but which ones to omit? That was not as important because those are ones that are right on the edge of your visibility anyway. So they decided on 3,800 stars. And so he went to the computing center at UC Berkeley, and this is a fun picture of the long printout that was produced listing all those 3,800 stars. And when that was figured out, they also decided to produce the stars in a different way than the Germans did. Now, what the Germans did and everybody else was they produced basically slides of the constellations by drilling holes in a sheet of metal. And that produced nice round-looking stars, which were not really that realistic. If you looked at the sky in the planetariums of those days, it was nice, but all the stars were perfectly round. Well, what they decided to do with the Morrison projector was they came up with a method of using grains of carborundum grit. In optical work, you have this sandpaper-like material, grains of sand, and those were used as abrasives to grind mirrors and lenses. And they sorted out the grains by size, and the bigger ones would represent brighter stars. And so this optical worker, Frances Greeby, her nickname was Reet, she hand placed those 3,800 grains of carborundum sorted by size into their proper positions onto 32 lens surfaces. Took her 6 months to do. She had to be really careful. She had to wear a breath mask so she didn't accidentally blow something out of place. She was the only person known who could blow the universe away with a single sneeze. But it took her 6 months to hand place all these grains in their positions. And what was projected after that were these tiny irregular looking stars, not round holes. And that's produced the illusion of a point source. And it was thought that made the stars look much more realistic. And so when the machine debuted in 1952, that was the conclusion. A Coronet magazine article came out at that year after the premiere of the planetarium. The title was "They Outzeiced Zeiss." And even the director of the Adler Planetarium in Chicago that had a German projector came and said, "This sky is the best in the world, the most perfect I've ever seen." And a number of accolades like that came. It's just a tribute to the hard work that was done by the people here at the Academy. And the people who built this projector were staff, or volunteers, and there were lots of donated services. And they came up with what was at the time heralded as the best planetarium projector in the world for a major planetarium.
From start to finish, how many years did it take them to make it?
The actual work took 4 years, but as with our own planetarium shows, when we produce shows, we like to say, well, it takes about 18 months to produce the show, but then there's a lot of thought that goes into it before then. So there's a longer envelope of time that's involved. So they were thinking about this for quite a while. And some of the things they were kind of making up as they went, because there aren't a lot of plans that came out until the machine was actually built. So it was an interesting project. And it was a huge, massive star projector. It was 13 feet long, weighed 2.5 tons. It was 5,000 pounds. And a lot of people ask, why can't you use the projector in the new museum? Why can't you at least display it on the floor? Well, largely that's because it's 5,000 pounds. And the floors are not strong enough to hold that kind of weight anymore. We have a very green building with radiant heating built into the floors, and it just isn't strong enough to hold that. So, and then the design of the planetarium is completely changed and wouldn't accommodate this kind of projector nowadays. And again, it's huge. It would block a lot of sight lines for a lot of people. So
and
it had its day.
People often ask, where is the projector now if it's not at the Academy?
It was put in storage. It's in mothballs, as they say. It was wrapped up in an automobile storage bag and is now stored at a warehouse where a number of other Academy artifacts from the original building are still kept, from the exhibits department and a number of other things like that. So it's not on display. It's in storage. We haven't gotten rid of it. We haven't sold it. We haven't tossed it into the bay. We're still trying to figure out exactly what to do with it, though, because its place in the history of planetariums is really so important. So it was named after Alexander Morrison, who was an attorney here in San Francisco around the turn of the century, Academy benefactor. He was one of the co-founders of the law firm of Morrison and Forster. Some people may be familiar with that name. And during the project, the school children of San Francisco donated lunch money and nickels and dimes amounting to $10,000 toward the building of the planetarium projector. So we feel a really, really great sense of debt to the school children, not just of San Francisco, but the whole Bay Area. So we have a very, very robust school program because of that. as a thank you to them. And so the planetarium was built at a time when we were building projectors from scratch. We didn't have computer graphics or custom built projectors that you could buy and would produce a galaxy or an aurora. You had to cobble together things that were made of whatever you could find. I mean, it's kind of like the professor in Gilligan's Island making a radio out of coconut shells. It felt kind of like that. We were grabbing textured bottles, rippled plastic and reflective materials, and throwing them together and see what they did to light. And we simulated things like galaxies and nebulae and auroras and comets and flames, all sorts of things. Those were fun times, very creative, and some of the projectors were really quite well done. And I would dare say some of the effects that they came up with, the ones that were really given a lot of attention and time and tender loving care, would rival some of the computer graphics that are done today. But they were really spectacular. Some of that technology went into a couple of other projects that I'll talk about later on. One of the most famous features of the planetarium, as you can see there all, at the bottom of the picture with the star projector, is that skyline of San Francisco. Mm-hmm. That was fairly typical for the time, where to make it seem as if you're really outside, well, you look around, you would see the skyline of your city. And so we have City Hall and the Bay Bridge and Coit Tower and Alcatraz and other landmarks. And these were cut out of the dome. And that made it a little awkward sometimes when we tried to project a landscape along the horizon. You'd see City Hall sticking up out of a crater on Mars. A lot of people ask, where is that? How come we can't use that in the new planetarium? Well, we saved a small part of it, but again, it wouldn't fit the tilted dome that we have in the planetarium today. And it did get a little awkward sometimes, as I mentioned, when it interfered with the projected scenes. And here are a couple of others with an artist who did many of them in our collection. This is David Perazzo, who was a wonderful artist, very talented, and he painted 360-degree landscapes like cycloramas, and they were projected all around the horizon of the dome. You could simulate Stonehenge or an observatory or another planet's surface. You could go back in time to look at the pyramids of Egypt. Of course, how convincing these were depended on how realistic the artwork was, and Dave was a tremendous artist. He was also
What's the observatory on the bottom there?
That is a representation. I think it's the Mount Palomar Observatory with the 200-inch telescope. That was the classic observatory of its time. So Dave would be instrumental in another project that would come about. But something really interesting that the planetarium also got involved in was making recordings of astronomical lectures, and these were done by one of our staff. His name was Hugh Bernhard. Who was a writer. He worked for the San Francisco Examiner. He also wrote a science fiction novel. But he produced this small series of planetarium-style lectures where he talked about particular topics. And there were 5 or 6 of these that were put out. I'm missing one here in the collection. But here's a little clip of what one of these sounded like. You might have to listen carefully, but here's Hugh.
As we gaze at the night skies, so too are there likely to be intelligent beings somewhere out there? Beings who look at the constellations in their own darkened heavens and see among them a star we call the sun, and who, like us, wonder, are we alone?
So dramatic.
Yeah.
And with the Hammond organ.
Did they ever do these live, or did they only record them?
These were recorded versions of what could have been used in the planetarium shows, because these were 45-minute long talks, which is about the standard length of a planetarium show in those days. And so accompanied by visuals, these were probably very close to what you could have seen in a planetarium show back at that time. But those were fun, and they're a kick to listen to. And then along came one of the most innovative things done in a planetarium. In 1958, a couple of people, Henry Jacobs, who was a sound engineer, and Jordan Belson, who was a filmmaker, proposed a new use for the planetarium. Now, the planetariums were still a very, very new thing. It was a theater in the round. People faced the center of the room, and Morrison Planetarium had a series of speakers along the periphery of the dome. There were actually about 36 speakers lined up all around the dome. And they came up with the idea of being able to channel all the sound to any one of those speakers. So the sound only came from that one spot, but they could also move it around and cycle the sound around the audience and create a spinning effect. And they called that the Vortex Effect. And that's where the name of this presentation came from. And part of the Vortex Effect was not just the sound, but also the visuals, which were very radially oriented. Again, in the planetarium, people faced the center of the room. They looked up and they could see the dome above them, which was this frameless canvas that had no borders, and you could create the illusion of floating in space. And that's what Jordan Belson's visuals tried to accomplish. It was like tried to present the illusion of images just coming out from the center of the dome and sliding down the sides of the walls. And here's what a part of a Vortex concert may have sounded like back at that time. Remember, this is 1958. Electronic music in 1958 was not what we think of today as electronic music. It was more what Henry Jacobs described as bloops and bleeps and space age Sputnik influenced stuff. So here's a little bit of what they called electronic music back at that time. See if you can hear this. If you saw the film Forbidden Planet, it's very much like that. Lots of echo, lots of reverb, and lots of repetition. Now, back at that time,
Kind of spooky.
It is. And back at that time, what was also in very much in fashion, or what had just come out, was magnetic tape. And Henry Jacobs discovered, well, you could make a loop of a sound using magnetic tape. And you could repeat the sound of ping pong balls or rain or any sound and just make it repeat over and over and over and over again, which people had not thought of before. And so that was something else that was incorporated into the Vortex. And here is something of a hint of what the visuals may have looked like. Vortex was never filmed because the images were too dim. But Jordan Belson produced several short films afterward, one of which was called Allures, which has elements of what were used in Vortex. And I'm going to start this and then jump ahead to what was closer to what he did right here. So you can see these are very radial images, very mandala-like, coming from a central point, and it fit the dome and accommodated all the music and the shape of the dome perfectly. And these were moire patterns and lots of really interesting but generally circular type images. Now, an assistant for this was David Perazzo, the artist that I talked about earlier. And he tried to revive Vortex later on. I'll talk a little bit about that. But the initial run of Vortex ran for about 3 years. Did really well. Got a great audience response. But the crowd was not quite what the museum was ready for, because these were people who were more interested in art than in science, and they were called bohemians by the director of the museum, and they smoked funny cigarettes outside while waiting in line to get into the building, and they were just a different kind of crowd than the Academy was ready for, and they kind of tried to distance themselves from that. And so the relationship with Vortex didn't last past 1958, 1959. But nowadays, with other kinds of entertainment that are being offered in planetariums all around the world, they want people who are not necessarily interested in just science or astronomy. They want a different kind of audience. But in these early days, having a different audience was really kind of a weird experience for museum administrators of the day.
Yeah, we welcome the artists nowadays.
Absolutely. Yeah, we love the creativity. And David Perazzo, that artist that I talked about earlier, tried to revive Vortex, and he tried to use some of the same concepts that Jordan Belson used, and even use some of what I believe are the same kinds of projectors to create these mandala patterns and moire effects covering the dome. But this time around, he worked with Douglas McKechnie, who was an electronic musician who composed music on a Moog synthesizer. And by that time, in 1974, it was real music. So it really sounded like something. And they also included bits of Tomita in the shows and modern electronic music, much more melodic and real sounding as far as music was concerned, not just
the bleeps and bloops.
Yeah, right. So they tried a trial run again in 1974. It lasted about a month or two, but by that time, even Jordan Belson and Henry Jacobs had felt that Vortex had its day. It was done. By that time, 2001 had come out. People saw what could be done with abstract visuals. And there were other things come along. Belson and Jacobs had parted ways. And so this version of Vortex only lasted in 1974 for about a month or two. But it was followed immediately by another form of abstract entertainment, which lasted for more than 20 years on Morrison, and that was Lazarium. At that time, in 1973, a filmmaker in Los Angeles came up with the idea of projecting imagery with lasers in a planetarium. And he tried it as a film at first, but wasn't happy with the results. And so he created a live laser show called Lazarium that lasted for quite a while. It was extremely popular and had many imitators, and we ran that here at Morrison Planetarium on and off for about 25 years or so. And it included, just spectacular patterns. And the really big appeal was the high-tech nature of using a laser and the intensity of the colors and the brightness. And after Vortex, which was intentionally faint, required dark adaptation, Lazarium literally just blew people away. It really opened their eyes to this brand new technology. And the shows were themed to different types of music. The first show had a variety of music, including classical and rock, and then they started to focus more on individual bands. But it ran the gamut from classical to jazz to new age to rock to the Beatles, and the most popular, most often requested show was Pink Floyd. And so those are interesting to do, and we had really great crowds for that. Those are fun days as well. And I think you have a clip of Lazarium.
Yeah, let me switch to my screen real quick.
Now, don't base your impression on just one little bit. There was a whole variety of music that was used. They went into graphics. They started off being just abstract, using interference patterns and very non-representational images. Then they got into animation and cartoons, which they could use to tell a story of sorts. And they could go in time with the music, and it was fun again. And there are still some companies doing laser shows in other planetariums even today. So.
Oh yeah, I've seen some of them. They're pretty cool.
Yeah.
You've got Laser Beyonce even nowadays. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah. And we did a number of other tie-ins as well, thematically. In around 1980 or so, we had Klingons in the planetarium. The museum did a traveling exhibit. This was around 1980, I think. That came from the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry. It was based on Star Trek. It was called Federation Science. And along with that came a planetarium show that was narrated by LeVar Burton. And it took the scenario of a training mission for cadets where you were taken to different objects in the galaxy and explored different objects. So that was fun. And that drew a number of fans, including Klingons, these guys behaved themselves during the show. They didn't show up for every show. but fortunately they didn't cause any trouble when they were here, although some of the other audience members were a little intimidated by them. But that was an interesting time as well. We had a lot of interesting things occurred during that exhibit, and for the museum it was a very different kind of thing for us. And
that is surprising that Klingons would want to learn about the Federation.
Yeah. And we had a couple of other movie close encounters. These did not quite happen, but location scouts came to talk with us about possibly using the planetarium as a set for a futuristic scenario. One of those was for Bicentennial Man, the movies with Robin Williams playing a robot. They wanted to use the planetarium as a large courtroom in the future. And then they asked if we could move the star projector out of the way. Well, we didn't have an elevator under the star projector that could do that. So we told them, sorry, we can't. So they actually went to City Hall to do the filming for that scene. And their lights set off the water sprinklers. So we kind of dodged a bullet with that one. Another interesting project that not many people know about was a location scout for a J.J. Abrams film called Flyby. Came and talked with us about possibly using the planetarium as a set. Nothing ever came of that, but Flyby was the secret code name for a Superman film that J.J. Abrams would have written. So that was something interesting. Those were shoulda, coulda, woulda. What we did do was we got into Gumby in.
And I'm sharing my video of this one too, right?
Okay, yes, you had that video. These are a couple of shots. They came and talked with us. They wanted Gumby to visit a planetarium, so they had him visit a planetarium, which looked a lot like an observatory. But if you blow this up, there's the planetarium on the outside, and on the inside, there's the planetarium. Now they used a projector that looked more like the German Zeiss, but look at the horizon. That is the scene. That is San Francisco skyline from Morrison Planetarium that they used in their planetarium for Gumby to visit. So,
the show is starting.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, Gumby. So,
wow.
Yeah, we made Gumby. And more recently, HBO used the planetarium as a location for the series Looking, so the planetarium, like the museum, has gone through a number of changes. We went from being this campus of buildings built at different times, beginning in 1916, all the way out to about 1950 or so. 1970 is when one of the last buildings was built. Nowadays, of course, we've got this beautiful Renzo piano building with the green roof, and everything is under that one roof. The planetarium itself has also evolved from being the concentric, non-tilted dome to a spectacular tilted digital dome where people can see computer-generated presentations, trips through the galaxy that are far more convincing than we could ever hope to do in the original planetarium. And with the power of computer graphics, we can do so much more. We can represent the other sciences that are also resident at the Academy. We've done shows that incorporate information from geology and biology, aquatic science. We've done shows about earthquakes and coral reefs, and so we are really a voice for all the sciences, especially those here at the Academy. So we're not just astronomy. We don't forget our astronomical roots. We can present astronomical topics, but we can also do so much more. That's what we like to stretch our limbs a little bit, flex our creative muscles, and go into these other areas that can be represented so well in the immersive environment of the dome. So we really are pleased to see how that is working for us. Now, there are many planetariums that still are astronomy only, and that's great if it works for them. But we are within a larger natural science museum, and this way of expressing ourselves and the other sciences works well for us as a part of the Academy of Sciences. And we can give the whole topic, all the biological sciences that we talk about at the Academy, we can give them more context and talk about how biodiversity, which we love to talk about, may not be restricted to just one planet there might be others that host that as well. So we like to remind people that that's what science is all about, discovering more and more and more about our universe, because we've discovered, what is it now, more than 4,000 other planets.
Mm-hmm. And more candidates than that too.
And growing.
Yeah.
So we talk about that, and we like to provide that context for the other sciences. And we've got a new show that is in the can. We're waiting for a premiere for that, and that is Big Astronomy, which is it's already an award winner. It won an award at an Australian film festival called Dome Under as Best Educational Program, and it's about the observatories in Chile, which are that's considered the best place for astronomy in the world, and the communities that make those important observatories work, and what it takes to support them. And that's the story that we really are looking forward to telling when we open that show in later in September. Do you have a clip of that?
I do. Yeah, let me share again.
Yeah, let's do that.
This is our trailer for the show.
Yeah. There's major science going on there.
And I believe that our cosmic conversation for next week is going to be about big astronomy, correct?
Yeah, it is. Some of the visualization team that went down to Chile, and they shot everything that you saw there. It was a new experience for them because they're computer graphics artists, but they had to learn the process of filmmaking and how to shoot things and how to tell a story. And they tried a number of new techniques that were a real adventure for them to learn. And they had some adventures down in Chile. While they were there was an earthquake that happened, and they saw a number of the major observatories. And our next cosmic conversation is going to be with at least one of the people on that team. And
I think both. I think Mike is on as well. So
okay.
Ken and Mike will be.
Yeah, and that show has its world premiere. I think September 26th, I think, yeah. And we're really looking forward to telling that story about the spectacular science being done at those facilities and what it takes to keep those operations going. So that's the past and present of Morrison Planetarium. Seeing the evolution of the facility has been really exciting to see how the museum has changed with the times and how the technology has changed as well to be able to present the kinds of things that we just saw. So that's been terrific. And I'm looking forward to seeing what else develops in the future.
Yeah. It looks like we got a couple of questions here.
What is your favorite non-astronomical programming event that's played in the Morrison? Boy, Mike, there are so many. Near the very top of the list has to be Lazarium, but we also did a number of music concerts as early as the early 70s, maybe even into the 60s. We were presenting live music performances under the stars. And we had harpsichord, we had piano, we had Peruvian flutes, we had harps, we had electronic music. And those were interesting, and people really flocked to those because a planetarium is such an unusual venue for that kind of thing. Yeah, you can look at the stars, and the acoustics are interesting in a planetarium. So there were those sorts of things. Those were some of the favorite non-astronomical presentations that we've had here in the years that I've been here.
That's awesome.
How are the 360-degree panoramas projected? Well, great question, Cheryl. Thank you for asking that one. As you saw in that slide that I showed earlier of Dave Perazzo, and let me see if I can back up to it. He painted these long cyclorama-type images, which were on masonite. He liked masonite. And they were about 1 foot high and in sections about 4 feet long. Here you go. Here's Dave and a section of his panorama artwork. And there were 4 of these per panorama. And so they were photographed in sections. One little segment here, another segment here was photographed, the next segment over. And they were projected with 12 different projectors evenly spaced all around the dome. And they were butted up to each other so that the edges lined up. And we had to do a little bit of trickery to get the edges of the images to blend together so it looked continuous. But that way we could project this continuous 360-degree image all around the dome. So we could take the audience to other planets or to Stonehenge or to ancient Egypt or just anywhere a good artist could take us. So very, very interesting technique. Nowadays with computer graphics and full dome imagery, you can do that a lot more easily, I imagine. But yeah. As new stars, nebulae, and or galaxies are discovered, what are the criteria planetariums use to include in their sky view? Well, back in the days of the old planetarium, we couldn't change the star field projected by the big machine that you see in the background of our pictures here. The stars don't change, but we had slide projectors. So we could use the slide projectors to show people more recent photography of different images. Sometimes we could point out where a particular thing is in the sky that was newly discovered. So we could do that. Nowadays, of course, planetariums have digital databases that they can use and just pump right into their system, and bang, there it is in your sky. It's quite amazing what you can do with that technology now. So it was a little more awkward for us to work with new discoveries. We tried to do things and say, okay, a comet has just been found. Here's the comet in the sky. Nowadays, it's a lot more easy, a lot easier to do that. Lara says, is the moon slowly drifting away from us? If so, will it leave its orbit around Earth? And when will that happen, if that happens? Actually, Lara, that was one of the discoveries that was made as a result of the Apollo program. What 3 of the missions did was they left reflectors on the surface of the moon that were specially designed so they could reflect light straight back to its source. And scientists shined lasers at those reflectors. That allowed them to time the amount of time it took for the reflection to get back to Earth. And they could therefore calculate exactly how far away the moon was to a matter of inches. And by comparing measurements from year to year to year, they determined that the moon is actually moving away from us at roughly an inch per year. Now, it's never going to leave our orbit. At some point, Earth's gravity is going to say, wait a minute, stop, come back here. So it's never going to leave our orbit. But yeah, interesting question, Lara. And that's one of the things we were able to talk about in the original planetarium.
Looks like we have maybe 1 or 2, or we... Okay.
Which planetarium made the most lasting impression on you, and which would you like to visit out of the ones you haven't been to? Well, which made the biggest impression on me was Morrison Planetarium. I grew up at Morrison Planetarium, basically. There are a number of other planetariums that I'd love to visit. Some I have visited. I went to the Hayden Planetarium in New York and the Adler in Chicago, the Griffith in LA. I've been to those. I've been to the planetarium in Beijing, which is a spectacular facility. There's a new one being built in Shanghai, which looks really spectacular. I'd love to see that one someday. There are some very, very futuristic looking facilities in Japan that I'd love to go and see. But, you know, almost any place that has a planetarium, I'm there. I'd like to go and see them, see what they're doing, see how they do what they do, and see what I can learn from them, and maybe trade some ideas. Even the Atwood Sphere in Chicago, it's not a projection planetarium. It's a ball with holes in it. That was spectacular. I loved seeing that. And Yeah, I'd love to see every planetarium on the planet. There's not enough time to do that, but I'd really love to.
Yeah, I'm definitely one of those people that even if I'm on vacation, if there's a planetarium nearby, we're going. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. This was super interesting, Bing. Thank you for talking about the history of the Morrison for us today. And next week we'll be talking about big astronomy. So be sure to check that out. And as well as our weekly broadcasts we have on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. You can look those up on our Facebook page, Morrison Planetarium Facebook. And yeah, any last things you want to say, Bing, before we head out?
When this whole shelter-at-home thing is over, go visit your local planetarium and talk with them and tell them how much you appreciate the way they're bringing the universe down to Earth.
Mm-hmm. And once we're open again, we'll be so happy to see you all.